Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. I am Sepharosa Carroll, Program Executive for Mission from the Margins and the Ecumenical Indigenous Peoples Network with the World Council of Churches. Before we start these sessions, allow me a few seconds to share some very brief technical notes. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. And the earlier sessions of these webinars have already been uploaded. And now to some brief information about interpretation. You can follow this session in Spanish and French. If you need interpretation, click on the icon on the Zoom's bottom menu bar. It's the globe, it looks like a globe icon, and choose the language you wish. Then confirm that you have chosen the right interpretation on the Zoom bottom menu bar, the same global icon. It is important to note that if you are in a language channel, you will hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. So if you do not wish to hear the original audio, just click on mute original audio. During this session, as always, we are very happy to gather your questions for the Q&A session. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions of the speakers. In case of need for technical support, please reach out in writing to WCC CWM Technical Support Team via the Zoom chat box. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Adele Halliday. And Adele serves as the Anti-Racism and Equity Lead at the National Office of the United Church of Canada. She is currently a member of the World Council of Churches Reference Group on the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, and was among the co-creators of what is now the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network. Welcome, Adele. And now over to you.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and welcome to everyone for today's e-conference, Anti-Racist in Christ. This is day 3 of a 4-day conference, and we are very glad that you are here. Just to review where we have been so far, in case you are joining us for the first time. On day 1, we explored the theme, setting racism within its colonial and neo-imperial context. Yesterday on day 2, we explored the theme mission agencies' legacies, and we had panelists who came from Canada, the Cayman Islands, Peru, and the United Kingdom. On both days, we've had full and rich conversations, and here are just a few highlights from yesterday's discussion. We talked about how racism is a colonial legacy. We explored and interrogated images of a white Jesus, which we named as being rooted in constructs of whiteness and white supremacist culture. We talked about damaging and painful racial images that have impacted people's sense of self and instilled at times feelings of inferiority for racialized and Indigenous peoples. We named a clear link between past and present and the need to transform some of our present colonial practices. We talked about how racism is present and perpetuated in theologies, some of which have been very damaging, are continued to be rooted in colonialism, and that there's a need to decolonize our theologies. We spoke about the ways in which Christianity at times has been complicit, and finally named the need for anti-racism to be linked with repair, repentance, and reparations. Today, we will continue the conversation with a different theme, although related, of course, to the days gone before. Today, we are exploring the theme models for anti-racist action for white and other dominant racial groups. As part of the theme for today, we will consider ways in which racism is complex and requires ongoing critique and action that is mindful of the many different ways, many different factors that intersect and affect how racism manifests. We will consider the ways in which both church and society are being challenged to be actively anti-racist rather than being non-racist or passive. We will consider ways in which institutions and individuals, including churches, have a role to play in dismantling racism. As part of our ongoing conversation, we will also continue to consider theologies and the ways in which racism has been inherent and at times perpetuated in our theologies. And we'll continue to think about and reflect more on the church's call to action. To explore this theme today, we have 4 dynamic speakers who will be part of our panel. I'll introduce them very briefly now, and as we continue in today's session, their full biographies will appear in the chat. One of our panelists is Mr. Juan Carlos Chavez Quispe, who is Aymara from Bolivia. He is currently completing his PhD at the University of California. He's usually based in Riverside, California in the United States, but today is back home in Bolivia. We also have the Reverend Shibon Kernel, who is currently the Executive Secretary of Native American and Indigenous Ministries for the General Board of Global Ministries in the United Methodist Church, and he currently lives in Oklahoma in the United States. We have the Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis, who is the chaplain and dean of the Manning Memorial Chapel at Acadia University, and she currently lives in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, Canada. And we have the Reverend Seth Bispelway, who is a grassroots organizer, educator, and pastor in the United Church of Christ, and he currently lives in Tucson, Arizona in the United States. So a very warm welcome to Juan Carlos, Shimon, Marjorie, and Seth. We are very glad that you are all here to share your many insights with us today. In terms of the flow for today's session and conversation, this will not be necessarily a lecture style event, but we hope it will be a dynamic conversation where the panelists will be invited to reflect on a series of questions. And of course, all of you who are participants are also welcome to ask questions. Please use the question and answer box to write your questions there, and we will pause from time to time to receive those questions and invite the panelists to respond to them. So welcome once again, and let us begin with our first question. There is an image that will appear on the screen in just a moment, and I'm going to ask all of our panelists to respond to this question referencing this particular image. So considering the photo that is here, this image, what demonstrations of power have you witnessed in your own work against racism and colonial violence? So all of our panelists will respond. I'll first invite Juan Carlos to offer your responses, please. Juan Carlos.
Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias a Adele. Y gracias también por mostrarnos esa imagen que justamente nos permite hoy reflexionar sobre diversos aspectos que tienen que ver con la lucha de los derechos de las poblaciones marginadas. Luchar por los derechos individuales y colectivos es una constante en la historia de las poblaciones marginadas y a lo largo de los años esto se ha traducido en la adopción de estrategias que permitan alcanzar resultados positivos en contextos
reach positive results in changing neo-imperial context. We know the resistance movement for the Afro-American community after the killing of George Floyd in the United States, because this is a game changer in the policy making that will pay more attention to the needs of this marginalized community. For example, in academic terms, which is where I could see a substantial change, the inclusion of topics and insights from the perspective of authors and activists from the Afro-American community, which will allow and has already helped about this fight against racism. And it has also generated these public manifestations. I believe this is going to bring about a change which will be visible until we manage to reduce, until its elimination, the different kind of treatment based on phenotypic traits, which just add to the population diversity in the world. Throughout the years, I could also see different scenes with demonstrations of power that under the pretext of strengthening democracy and to fulfill the rule of law had derived in racist, classist, and xenophobic acts. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, the political conflicts after the refoundation of the plural state of Bolivia, and recently the change of government between 2019 and 2020 had exacerbated a ethnic cultural polarity at different levels in the country. Beyond the criticisms to the world order that this system causes to the marginalized communities, and something which is not aligned to the national state in Bolivia, the right for the land rights and the right for the territory through different grassroots and community-based communities. It is in the process of revalidating the national identities which had suffered more than 5 centuries of oppression. Another example I can show you with regards to demonstrations of power is the indiscriminated use of natural resources in favor of the minority, the care for the Mother Earth through community-based practices where the collective right is the most important one, is important because it shows that another way of life is possible. With that, important actions like the food production with sovereignty is important to keep and to fulfill the needs of the world population and to provide the most needy countries with food, but to call them as backwards because it doesn't obey the hegemonic power is, in my opinion, just a response for the power structures, which at the end of the day benefit themselves for the system. And at the end of the day, what they have to do as communities is to go out to the streets with public protests to claim the rights which had been denied to us. And with that, we can be able to reach a better way of life for us and for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Next, let's hear from Shibon in terms of your reflections on this photo, please.
Yes, thank you for having me today. When I look at a photo like this, I think one of the most powerful interpretations is kind of witnessing the community coming together to stand against, to resist various forms of oppression that each of our communities have faced historically. When we analyze whether it's the role of indigenous peoples in countries or minoritized communities in various countries across the world, whatever it may be, we can witness that historically our communities have been isolated with so-called injustices and people saying things such as, well, it's not that big of a deal, or there's not that many that are impacted by racism, there's not that many impacted by other forms of injustices. But what we have seen happen over the past several years, and specifically over the past year, are these communities are now starting to communicate with each other and say, wait a second, what's happened to your community is now happening to mine. And when we start to stand in solidarity with each other, we're really starting to witness the real power in creating a social change across the world that says we will not be treated this way anymore. Now, specifically speaking, in terms of indigenous peoples, this is something that has been a tool of colonizing communities historically for centuries, because we are so isolated, whether it be in specific rural areas across our countries or what have you, that when we put all the numbers together, when we put all of the names of our indigenous groups together, we witness that there's a widespread, massive attempt to not only engage in various forms of genocide and displacement, but really at the root is racist undertones. And now as we have begun the communication, we're starting to say, wait a second, we can build something better than this. We don't have to suffer in this way. And in fact, one of the catchphrases that I share whenever I go across the various places to speak on behalf of our communities is that, we are really in a mode of fighting just to exist. We're not even talking about the political structure, and we're not even talking about denominational structures. We're not even talking about those things. This is really the right to see tomorrow, to survive to another day. So I have witnessed some of these, these images here, and it has been, I guess you could say, life transforming, because we're starting to now see these voices being cultivated together to say, where can we now work together? And in fact, what we're starting to witness too is that rather than being considered minoritized communities, it's really a majority, that communities now have, we've been suffering in mass And so that's something I think we're just now in the beginning stages of witnessing this. And for those that may have been exposed to politics in the United States, politics in church denominations in North America, that's really at the root of some of the resistance that we have been facing when we're trying to create change. When we look at leadership, when we look at representation, when we look at all of these things that systematically, historically, communities have been left out of that position of privilege. And so we're starting to see those foundations of that identity now start to be shaken. And so when I see these photos, I start to say, you know, this is our time is here. And even amongst those indigenous communities in North America, for historically, we have been isolated in different areas. You know, we were put on what we called reservation systems, displaced from our homelands and territorial domains. And now we're starting to begin to communicate even amongst, in the US, we say tribal communities, from indigenous community to indigenous communities. And that's really where we're seeing the power emerge and starting to create a change that is more inclusive of all the diversity of creation, and really even more inclusive of understanding a broader cosmology of how do we live in harmony with such a diverse world, and how do we live in harmony with this Earth Mother that protects us and gives us everything that we need for life. And so, you know, it has taken so much to get to this point, though. As our relative Juan was sharing, is that sometimes we advocate through the systems of power, that at the end of the day, we have to go to the streets. We have to go and say, this is the only thing, no one else is listening to us, that there may not be a tomorrow for many of our people. And so we have gone to those protests, and that's kind of where we see that power coming out. But as we all know, that structures of privilege, structures of, you know, racist undertones will never allow that to always exist. They'll start criminalizing dissent. They'll start making new laws that says we can't, you know, even say no, that you'll start to see this. And that's where we're in the middle of here in the United States, is various states are starting to push those types of things simply for people saying, we won't allow you to treat us that way, that it's being criminalized. And so, but the good thing is, slowly but surely, even non-minoritized communities, people of faith, are starting to understand. Even though we have a lot of work to do, I still have hope that we're now beginning to take those steps to make the right decisions on how we embrace such a diverse world. And I think that is something that I have witnessed in denominations, especially in our indigenous communities, but we're now starting to have that conversation between those that are considered minorities and the non-minorities communities. And I think that's something where we're going to start to see that change occur. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan, for those excellent reflections. Let's hear next from Marjorie. Your reflections on this image, please. Marjorie, I think you are muted. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. And maybe the one thing I'll say is that I've lived for some time in 4 countries. So what I will have to say is informed by that. I'm Jamaican, and that's where I've lived most of my life, but I've also lived in Britain for a short while in the States, and now I'm in Canada. So it's been interesting to experience this conversation in different contexts. For me, this photograph brings many things to mind. The first is demonstrations that we also had here in Wolfville. Now, Wolfville, Nova Scotia is a small little rural village, you have to understand. So demonstrations were held even in small rural communities like Wolfville in Canada. I'm sure just not in Nova Scotia, as we had in this case in Korea and in many parts of the world. One of the things that stood out for me with the demonstrations in Wolfville is that they were led by Black students from the university. So it was the Black students from Acadia University who organized the Black Lives Matter Solidarity demonstrations and conversations, because they appealed for not just a reaction to George Floyd or an awareness of racism in the immediate period, but for the interest of the white populations, the white allies in particular, to be sustained, and for difficult conversations to be had over a period of time. So I think there is some link, because the folks that I can see in the demonstration look young. So the youth, I think, are really important in this moment, because we are seeing young people stepping up and taking leadership in some very important ways. It also demonstrates for me the business of local action and global solidarity, that people are acting in their own locale to simultaneously express global solidarity for all forms of racism and discrimination, but also to galvanize attention to what's happening locally. One of the things that I'm working on is the President's Anti-Racism Task Force at the university. I'm the internal co-chair. So this also reminds me of the progress of the work in the local areas, in the local area. Here at the university, work was done some years ago, setting up a decolonization task force. So there has been a progress in focus in the discussion at the university, first on decolonization generally, secondly on indigenous rights, and I'm in Mi'kmaq, a guest of the Mi'kmaq people, and then now a focus on anti-Black racism, as well as anti-Indigenous racism. That's the work we are doing. And we're looking at, to put it in shorthand, how to mainstream this throughout the university. Locally, we also have an ecumenical organization, the Wolfville Area Interchurch Council, and the George Floyd murder has also galvanized deep discussions within this, what is basically, I think I'm the only Black face actually in the council. So what do we do as an ecumenical body, and how do we also look at what's going on in Canada? The latest murder of Muslims in a hate crime, the discovery of 215 bodies of Indigenous children. And we know from the testimonies of the survivors that that's not the only one. So there's a lot of focus here on anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and Islamophobia in recent times, because the question is, how does the white majority community show solidarity? Another thing I'd like to mention institutionally is research that has recently been done by Ingrid Waldron of Dalhousie University. One study looked at Black mental health professionals and how they assessed mental health care within the Nova Scotia Health Authority for Black people. And a specific study also was done using focus groups to look at Black young people with psychosis and what is happening culturally within the community and the barriers within the system as well to people really enjoying good mental health. I want to sum it up by saying that George Floyd's murder provided a kairos, and in my experience across the countries, as I mentioned to you, is that there are certain moments in time. In Britain, it was the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, where we can be galvanized at an accelerated pace, so that all of the work that has been plodding and going on suddenly gets the attention and suddenly gets a kind of currency that perhaps in other moments were not there. So my view is that one of the things we need to do is to be attentive to these kairos moments in the struggle for racial justice, when we can push in ways that perhaps we can't in other times, and the need to challenge white allies to take on an anti-racism lifestyle and not just be in and out of the struggle when something dramatic like George Floyd hits the headlines. So I stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marjorie. Let's hear from Seth now about your reflections on this image, please.
Thank you, Adele. Thank you, everybody. It's a gift to be with you all. As mentioned, I reside currently in Tucson, Arizona, on the traditional and occupied, unceded homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and its people. And it's an honor to be a part of this gathering. Like everyone else has said, for me, the photo is a moving image of the universality and the particularity of what solidarity can look like. It looks like a recognition of shared humanity and a recognition that there is no liberation from the deadly spiritualities that govern so much of our world. Certainly in the United States, I would classify those deadly governing spiritualities as white supremacy, patriarchy, militarism, and consumer capitalism. And for those of us gathered here as people of faith and conscience, interested in how the global church cannot just do more to combat these deadly spiritualities and also move beyond active complicity in them, but that, as Marjorie just mentioned, really, especially when it comes to dominant white people in the church, there's not more we can do. We're always interested in what more we can do, and that's a way to burn out. There's an embodied solidarity we must be. And so what's moving to me about this expression of solidarity from Korea is what it brings up and reminds me of in terms of the work I've done in my hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia. The work I did throughout the year 2017 until the white supremacist attack later that summer, and continue to do in ongoing casework. Even though I currently live in Arizona, I'm still involved. What was brought to bear in Charlottesville is what we see in many communities around the United States, which is the leaders of those seeking solidarity, because lives are on the line, whether it's a rally of white supremacists or public policy proposals aiming to strip people or limit their rights. The leaders in Charlottesville were young people, LGBTQIA people, and women, and people of color, and combinations of all of the above. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll just put a fine point on it. These are groups that especially white church in the United States, speaking out of my own context and identity, historically marginalizes or diminishes the experiences of when they're not actively being oppressed by the church. And so what's moving about this expression of solidarity, similar to, as was pointed out, murals of George Floyd painted on the apartheid wall near occupied West Bank, Palestine, and so on around the world, is the universal recognition that our humanities and liberations are bound up with each other. And then the particular need we have as white, speaking for myself, people with European heritage, to be in solidarity and get specific and recognize that Black Lives Matter, for example, is not just a slogan. It's not a slogan, but a way of living with gospel specificity. Because in a society and culture that is governed by white supremacy, patriarchy, militarism, and consumer capitalism, to assert that Black Lives Matter is not just a issue of the moment that has highs and lows depending on the news cycle, but a way of living that we are called to with gospel specificity. So the need to listen to and come alongside those leaders, young people, LGBTQIA, women, people of color, who are saying, our lives are on the line, our lives matter. The governing deadly spiritualities are actively crushing them. What are we doing as a church, as white people in the so-called Christian church, if we are not saying, okay, how high do you need me to jump in the name of Jesus? And then see where we go from there. And it was an honor in that organizing work and finding myself in relationship, which I'll get into more later, with a lot of those originating organizers in Charlottesville to build relationship, build trust, and see how people of faith and conscience could come alongside their desire to confront the violent white supremacists who planned and did bring violence, hate, and murder to Charlottesville, and all the healing that was needed in that, because there was a lot of repair to do, because again, these are groups that have been historically marginalized or oppressed by the church expressions that I and many are a part of in the United States.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you to all of you for your responses to this first question. Many of you, all of you have named in different ways public protests as a key way for engaging in resistance, of advocacy for racial justice, of being in solidarity, of witnessing together and working towards a shared humanity. About protests, about advocacy and taking to the streets as a key way of claiming space, of naming rights, of local action in the broader context of global solidarity, and the imperative of working towards changing tomorrow in order to work towards liberation We've also named the ways in which people, many of the people who are protesting on the streets are people who have been on the margins, people who have been historically oppressed by church and society, and are taking to the streets to name and claim space. And part of why we are doing this is both our call as people of faith, and also because it's a question of life and death. So thank you for this excellent beginning to this continued conversation, and particularly for the reflections on this image. Participants, we would invite you to use the Q&A box if you have questions for any of our panelists, and we will pause at various times to respond to those questions. So please feel free to write those into the box. Next, we would invite a response from our panelists to another question. So how have existing mechanisms, policies, statements, and gestures by churches, so have they been adequate in addressing racism? Mechanisms, policy statements, and gestures, have they been adequate by churches in addressing racism? As well, noting that many churches have apologized in some contexts for past and present historical challenges, and have these been enough? So we'll first invite a response from Shimon, and then others may respond as well. So Shimon, over to you for your first response, please.
Thank you, Adele. When I look at this question that is being asked, like have existing mechanisms and policies, et cetera, been adequate enough? I'm always going to come up with the simple answer of no. That in my opinion, that words have to be followed up by action. And for those that may not know, that several years ago, I was our United Methodist Church's denominational point person on acts of repentance towards Indigenous peoples, acknowledging the harms that have occurred historically to Indigenous communities by this branch of Christianity in the United Methodist Church. Everyone was in a pursuit of just give us a list of things we need to do and a statement we need to say, and then they moved on with life. And And I kept saying, no, I will not prefabricate any type of statement. I will not prefabricate any type of so-called repentance or reconciliation. I said, tell me who your indigenous communities are in your back door that you have no idea, or even there, or even in existence. And so when I say, when I look at this question, the first portion, I say, no, it's not adequate. Now, do I think we need to not do that? I do think there's a purpose there. There's a need there to at least acknowledge what has happened historically, but it doesn't stop there. It's a small piece of building an anti-racist society can be a part of it. It's a small piece of that overall endeavor. And so that's one of the things that, as I look at that, I think there's a purpose. But when we address institutional racism, when we address racism in society, it's a starting point. It's a first step in saying, now which direction do we go to intentionally dismantle these structures that we are seeing leading to these oppressive situations all across the board. So it doesn't stop there. In fact, it starts there. And needless to say, in our particular denomination, those words weren't always welcome. They just wanted to be over, be done with it. Like, okay, we're good people now. I'm not racist. I don't do harm. But that's actually where the harm occurs. The cyclical nature of violence that occurs to society. That's what happens. And so, when I think about that, I say no, it's not. And my first question when I went to region throughout the United States, asking them, my first question was, how far do you want to go? Because to restore balance amongst races, let's just speak intentionally to indigenous peoples, you're looking at the returning of land, you're looking at the ceasing of harm, you're looking at addressing missing and murdered indigenous peoples, women, children who have been kidnapped all throughout this country and in Canada and really all across the world. You're looking at, how have people's been displaced and their territories have been opened up to extractive ministries that are harming industries that are harming people. How far do you want to go? My hope is that this gospel that we read wants us to go all the way until we lose our own life for the sake of those that are around us, for the sake of those that are hurting. So I say that they're not adequate. It's a first step in developing those actions that will explicitly, intentionally dismantle racism. And so, and to get to the second portion, I want to see here. Some churches have done that apology. I think it's appropriate to engage in acts of contrition, of apologizing, and even making a covenant to do no harm from this day forward. I think that's really important for people of faith, for people who are spiritually minded. But what we have failed to realize is how massive the trauma truly is. And as we were sharing just a little while ago, Marjorie, I believe, had talked about in our First Nations communities, and I want to say in Canada, but our territories, we've never had borders historically. These are colonized borders between what we consider Mexico, what we consider Canada, and the US. We have communities of indigenous peoples that have migrated historically all throughout. So just this past couple of weeks, we have discovered a mass grave at a residential school, which is a re-education center that was a part of governmental policy that our children went to, of hundreds of bodies. And since that initial mass grave was found, they found 3 more at other residential schools in the past few days. And when we think about harming a community, is that we have to give a community the ability to process, to heal within themselves, because that trauma keeps occurring over and over again. And what I would say is, even I'm glad at least there are those people in positions of power that are at least searching these residential schools in First Nations communities of Canada. I would say in the US, we had the same boarding schools here, but there's no one searching for those types of situations, those types of burials. And that's what my fear is that it's not even on the radar screen in some of our communities. And so that harm and that violence of racist undertones is being perpetuated, only to find out, when a denomination or a church wants to say, well, let's be on the same page now, let's reconcile with each other. We have the statement of 2012 here. You can see we apologize, but the harm hasn't stopped. It hasn't been discontinued. It's going on and on again. When does that stop? When do we hold people of faith accountable and saying, no, that the essence of the gospel is removing one's privilege, removing one's power, and giving it to those who have no recognition in the world, and saying, I won't do it anymore. And that's in the institution, that's in society, that's in our churches, and everywhere. We look at the Episcopal leadership, Indigenous peoples are only a handful. We look at recognizing the spiritualities of Indigenous peoples. How many times do we see a dialogue of a person looking, coming up with this hierarchical, patriarchal view that even devalues traditional practices of Indigenous peoples? Is that when do we become equal? And so I think these moments of apologizing, of making those statements, are just the first step in entering a relationship that is healthy with persons who are considered minoritized. And from that conversation that is starting, then you start putting the pieces together of building a just society where we have a place where we don't have to worry about our existence, and we can thrive, we can share in our spirituality, we can share in our love for our richness of each other's cultures and the reverence of each other's lives. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those reflections. Thank you. I wonder if any of our other panelists might want to offer some brief comments also in response to the same question. Juan Carlos, is there anything you would like to share in response to this question about policies and statements and apologies?
Bueno, yo agradezco mucho a Siobhan, quien fue tan honesto en darnos todas esas perspectivas.
Honest with your perspectives, which I completely agree with. This has been replicated throughout history. It continues to date, and they go against many indigenous populations in Bolivia anyway, which is what I know best, but it also happens in other regions and in other countries. So these perspectives in our statements, declarations, documents, they're one thing. They're one response to some objective that they have, which they want to show internationally, but what is lived in the communities is quite different. And there we can see different forms of going against the rights of marginalized peoples, such as indigenous peoples here in Bolivia, but also against other populations which are being oppressed due to differences in identity. In that sense, it would be good to make a difference between those documents that are issued by institutions and religious leaders. In their position, they can make wonderful statements, consistent ones, but they will not necessarily go to the rest of the community, nor will they be implemented necessarily. So they might not be very useful since they're not transforming the life of the communities. In that sense, it would be good. We are getting an interruption in the communication.
I think Juan Carlos is frozen. Maybe it's a technical challenge in the moment. So I wonder if we might pause. We'll come back to Juan Carlos and see if we can hear additional insights to that question. In the meantime, I wonder if, Juan Carlos, you're back. Would you like to continue?
Sí, mil disculpas, hubo un problema. Tan solo mencionar eso, que reconocer la identidad que
Just wanted to mention, yes, recognizing our identity, who we are within our communities of faith and working together to make changes. This is something that we need if we actually want to make those transformations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Marjorie or Seth, would you like to offer some brief comments in reflection to this question? I see both of you nodding. Marjorie, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay, thanks. I think we must note that there is some progress has been made. For the United Church of Canada, we have Adele, we have Michael Blair as the first Black General Secretary, and all kinds of intersectionality things happening with us in these positions, but it's not enough. So I think the challenge in terms of these gestures has to do with lack of sustainability. For example, when I worked in the UK, a number of programs that had been set up by churches for Black theology and so on were all dismantled within a couple of years. Simon of Cyrene Institute and so on. So there's a question about lack of sustainability, of doing the bare minimum, setting up processes, setting up principles, but frustrating it by law and bureaucratic processes. So right here in Canada, Indigenous people have been complaining that although the government agreed in principle to give compensation, there are fights in the courts about how much compensation, and sometimes you just can't seem to breach the glass ceiling, although on paper the provisions are there. I think there's a need to sustain hope, because I find a lot of Black people saying, it doesn't matter, these institutions are not serious, it's not going to happen. And I've been reflecting on Revelation, on the apocalypse, the unveiling. And for the book of Revelation, for example, holding in tension the stark reality of empire, but also an eschatological hope that is already and not yet. And I think this is one of the big things. How do we maintain resilience and hope? I think the white people have to deal with white privilege. If you haven't read Peggy McIntosh, go back and read that book, it's online. But I find a big problem with a lot of folks is the sense of shame, of guilt, of resentment, and a lack of understanding of white privilege. I think that really has to happen. I feel that part of the maintaining of hope too is education, that all of us, Black and white, have to take responsibility for educating ourselves. So, you know, I found it hard when I was traumatized by George Floyd to have the energy to be educating white people about racism. Google, you know, at that point, I need to take care of myself. So we need to educate ourselves and educate the generations coming. I like this part after the temptations, I can't remember which gospel, where it says the devil left Jesus for a season. It's only, the reprieve is only for a season. So we have to take the long view and ensure that we support the young people and succeeding generations, Black, white, Indigenous, and educate them, you know, pass the baton, because this is not going to be to end. The final thing I would say is that the thing I find most painful is the indifference. It was Elie Wiesel who called it, I am probably misquoting him, the sin of Abel. He said Abel's sin was that Cain expressed his pain to Abel. God has not accepted my offering. And what was Abel's response as the righteous one? Nothing. He had no empathy for Cain. He expressed nothing, you know, and that has stuck with me from the 70s when I first read it. And that I find the most painful as a Black person, where white people, they wouldn't beat you up on the street, but they make no effort to use their white privilege to create spaces that within the institution to object to things that are wrong in places, especially when Black people are there. And in my view, if you agree with Wiesel, commit the sin of Abel. They don't hear us, they don't see us, and they do nothing to help. Anyway, let me stop at that.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you very much. Seth, would you like to offer some brief reflections?
Sure. As everyone said already well, the simple and direct answer to both of these questions is no. Statements, policies, and more by the church have been inadequate and not done enough. I would say white supremacy and white privilege maintain so much equity in large part because of the self-serving grace that we give ourselves, white people, for being quote unquote well-meaning. Well, we meant well. And so to go back to my previous answer, we're in a white supremacist society. The real work here to get towards any functional adequacy of repair, repentance, and reparations is first to locate ourselves, white and churches, denominations, so that we can honestly and properly name God is in the business of naming things and naming us. And we also claim a resurrected Christ. We are naming ourselves as people believe that there is power over these deadly spiritualities of white supremacy. And so until we're ready to move beyond guilt, white guilt, as Marjorie just mentioned, is such a useless and also self-serving waste of time for white people. It's just a chance to wallow, as opposed to honestly name what is the place in history and what is the place in the moment we are now, as people making claims about who this Jesus person is. George Floyd, for example, was executed by the cops who let him suffocate while he cried out for his parents. Well, Jesus, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, was executed by the cops. I'm not querying the text here. This is Jesus, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, was executed by the cops who let him suffocate while he cried out for his parents. Does that acknowledgement of the story we put ourselves in stop there, or does it move beyond? Because otherwise, an apology, like, oh, sorry, Jesus, you know, an apology without changed action, without a changed way of living, is just gaslighting. And churches, Christians, white Christians, need to be in the business of locating themselves before we do things that are quote unquote well-meaning. My friend Mark Charles, who I've also been on some events on, he's a Navajo man and Christian here in the United States, has talked several times about how there are different denominations, Christian denominations in the United States. I believe Presbyterian Church USA is one of them, who have, I think the United Church of Christ, which I'm a part of, is one of them, who have at a systemic or structural level repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which was hundreds of years ago the mechanism by which the colonization and genocide of indigenous peoples was essentially blessed, and Christian churches were complicit. And so there's been some fanfare among like these dominantly white denominations about this repudiation. And Mark Charles says, when faced with these kind of questions like, hey, will you bless us for doing this? And he's like, okay, so you've repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Have you given your land back? Have you made repair, for example? And they're like, well, no. Well, then you've repudiated nothing, right? And so that's kind of a broad level example. The last thing I think I would say to this question about adequacy is, I get that everyone is in process and it takes a while when the systems are so deadly. But if we are not in the resurrecting business, meaning as the white Christians who benefit so much from this deadly spirituality, even though it's poisoning us as well, then in the example of George Floyd, or the question of police abolition, another place where churches got stuck a lot in the past year, and I know just from my own direct experience, was, well, that was horrific. The police went too far, but they individualized the problem and the issue. And then we're like, I don't know though about defunding or abolishing the police. This gets back to my original point, which is just that we have to locate the truth of the matter, which is that law enforcement, the police in the United States, have their origins in slave patrols. And we as white people, especially of means and wealth, have already given ourselves police abolition. We are not under the boot of, or the knee of, that maintenance of the color line and class line, which is what we have set the police up to do. The system is working as it's designed. And so it's another form of gaslighting to say, I think George Floyd's murder is terrible, but I don't know about getting rid of the system that actively made that happen. It didn't have to be Derek Chauvin. We're claiming a resurrecting power, the same power. If we're repudiating things like the doctrine of discovery, it's the same animating thing, maybe at cost to our own bodily health, that should if we were witnessing that murder, would cause us to tackle the police officer out of the way, to get air, to get air back in the lungs.
Great, thank you, Seth, and thank you all for these responses. It's very clear that everyone thinks that they're not enough. Statements are not enough on their own unless they're followed by action, by very tangible action. And part of the particular challenge is that there's harm still being done. There's still trauma in many of our communities. There's intergenerational trauma. We've spoken about residential schools, anti-Black racism among those, the ongoing reality of white supremacy and white privilege, and the need and call to education and action around those. So thank you for those reflections. With that in mind, I wonder if we can turn to some of the questions that have emerged in the chat so far. I'll pose 3 questions, and our panelists, you might choose from any of those that you might want to respond to. So one question is, we've talked about these statements not being enough. Can you have change without an apology or confession? So that's one question. Another question for reflection is that decolonization or decolonizing can be done differently by the victims of colonization and the perpetrators. So what might be the role of the church in all of this? Can the church be a space to enable this in tandem? And one more question is a very practical one. So what might be some readings, reflections, actions around helping people adopt an anti-racist lifestyle or way of living with the gospel specifically? So a couple of questions for reflection, one on apology, one around decolonization, and one around actively living an anti-racist lifestyle. So any of you are welcome to respond to those questions. Maybe you can pick one to reflect on, and we can begin in any order.
Perhaps I'll take the last one in terms of what can be done. And I would like to suggest that maybe white people in different contexts can begin to look at who is in their context. So in the Canadian context, for example, you have a Black United Church of Canada clergy group. You have a Black Baptist Association. There is an anti-racist coalition in the Anglican Church, just 3 that I can think of offhand. And the United Church has announced the 40 days of activism on racism. And then you probably can explain that more, but the idea is that just before Advent, the church has the option and resources, just as we would take 40 days in Lent, to take 40 days to focus on anti-racism. So I would like to encourage people to ask questions about the history of Black people and Indigenous people in your context, right? Because some of us come in from outside, we come with some things, but there are people who have been in the context organizing. But sometimes white people in the context don't reach out for those resources. So those are some practical things I would say. Who are the Black people in your context? Who are the white allies in your context who are looking for other white people to have conversation with, to have a book club with, or whatever? And concretely, we have the proposal in the United Church of Canada for the 40 days of activism on racism, and resources at the click of a button.
Thank you, Marjorie. Do any of our other panelists have responses to any of those questions or things that you've heard so far? Seth, you look ready to go.
Is it that obvious? Sorry. I just on the question of is change possible without apology or confession? If we're talking about systemic change, like the kind of transformation we hope to see that brings liberation and life and elevates abundance for all people, I do believe that's possible without apology or confession from the perpetrators, historical and present, of sin and colonization. I think Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about this. You know, we're talking about, we do this work out of a, I think he used the word soul force, that loves our enemies, so to speak, whether they're in our churches sitting on their hands or members of the Ku Klux Klan in Charlottesville and everything in between, by expressing the love of God for those that are being demonized and oppressed and marginalized systemically and directly. And you just pray the Holy Spirit kind of does the rest of the work. This is actually where another thing, speaking to today's themes, where a lot of quote unquote well-meaning white folks get stuck, which is, well, or they pretend to get stuck so they can excuse inaction. But by saying, well, how are we going to love our enemies? And what are they going to think? You're going to love them by showing them God's expansive love for those whose lives are actively threatened and suppressed now. We can't be responsible for all the things all the time. Apology and confession has to come from a heart place ultimately. And so we move the systems and pray that people seeing God's love at work in the world, whether it's through the expansion of voting access or the humanization of our transgender siblings and access to rights for them, is you just pray they get it. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that, for example, our transgender siblings have access to rights and safety and more.
Thank you, Seth. Juan Carlos or Siobhan, any reflections from you?
Just in brief, I would say also, just to answer quickly, can you have change without an apology? I would also concur that yes, we have to think from the communities of those that have suffered oppression, those have suffered colonizing entities. If we sat here and waited for an apology from institutions, we would probably be extinct by now. So I think change can occur. And it's happening right now in North America, that change is being demanded by the masses that are now mobilizing, that are now developing those action plans, and that's without the consent of institutions. That's the changing of an entire mindset. So we see that happening now, and I'm even concerned about the decolonizing is done differently by the victims of colonization. I think this is where I believe it was Marjorie that used the term intersectionality, that really our communities are just now pulling the pieces out and back together of really how deep the levels of oppression, which includes racism, that are there, that, for Indigenous peoples, what I really say is that we have been so indoctrinated for 300 years now that we no longer need an outside entity to do the oppression. We do that now to ourselves, whether it's discrimination against interfaith practices. Even I stand here as a traditional practitioner. That's how I first identify myself, through the spiritualities of my ancestors. And historically, and I don't even want to say historically, even in the present day, those are still being demonized by members of the Christian church and society. So, when I look at that and I think about how do we understand it, it's about putting those pieces together of all the levels of oppression and saying, here is what we bring to this world, to creation. And it's not something that we need to demonize, but it's something that also is something that takes a little bit of a process, a little bit of a time to engage in. And I do think the church can be a place to help that healing process, but they cannot, I don't even know if it's something more than just having an open door to allow us a space to congregate, to allow us a space to worship in traditional formats, something to that effect, because so much work has to be done before we can engage in some of that conversation with the, just for lack of a better term, we have to realize when we use that term decolonizing, or a colonizing entity, we have to parallel it with that these are institutions that are harming people. They are perpetuators of violence. And so when we think about what does that mean when a perpetuator of violence wants to decolonize now, is that inherently that whatever system that comes out of that institution will continue that cycle, continue the cycle of abuse. And that's something I've tried to keep at the forefront of some of our denominational talks here in North America, saying, wait a second, if you're looking for the entity that has harmed to be also the solution, then we're going to have many problems. So at that time, I'll stop now.
Thank you so much for those reflections. Juan Carlos, is there anything that you might want to add? Any additional comments?
Sí, gracias. Yo quiero resaltar las palabras de Marjorie, quien mencionó el contexto como un elemento fundamental. Perdón, estoy con unos problemas justamente.
So sorry, I'm having some problems, but anyway. Yes, I would like to highlight that the context, it is wherever we are working or with whom we are working. It is precisely, I'm so sorry, I'm having some difficulties.
Okay. Well, I wonder if we might come back to Juan Carlos. So we continue time for reflections as we go along. And in the meantime, we can go to another question. And when Juan Carlos is available, we'll give him some additional space for reflection. For this next question, we'll first turn to Seth and then to Marjorie for response. And this is a practical question. In your anti-racism work, where are you finding pushback or resistance? So let's hear from Seth and then Marjorie, please.
Thank you. It's a good question, and I don't need all 5 minutes to answer. In the anti-racism work I found myself in, and the personal growth and mess ups along the way that I've navigated, the greatest pushback and resistance is from fellow white Christians who consider themselves liberal or progressive, and it's not even close. That's the greatest pushback. That was the case in Charlottesville, and it's the case in my current role as a pastor of a local United Church of Christ congregation that considers itself very open and affirming and welcoming, but is 99% white European heritage in its makeup. I'll just give a couple concrete examples. So the work that I did in Charlottesville, I and a queer colleague in the UCC created an entity that we called Congregate. And as part of our cohort and levers of accountability, we, our board of directors, so to speak, we had primarily women of color, faith leaders in the church, and others. And my commission, especially as someone who grew up in Charlottesville and as a cisgendered heterosexual white man pastor, was to talk to my fellow white pastors to try to get additional solidarity in showing up when the white supremacist rally came. And if you've seen pictures from Charlottesville, you see that unfortunately part of the reason I'm even on this panel or stand out is because it didn't work that well. And it's by the grace of God that I didn't want to stand out. But what was so telling is that these pastors, friends of mine, who would quote Dr. Martin Luther King 51 other weeks out of the year, when the desire and request for embodied solidarity came, these fellow white liberal Christians, for the most part, almost entirely though, quoted almost verbatim, without knowing it, the 8 Alabama clergymen that King is responding to in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And so I won't run through all the examples, but I have the emails and I have the conversations. And it was a Selma Bridge moment for Charlottesville in many ways. And my other example would be, even before the murder of George Floyd, I incorporated a confession surrounding the lynching and murder of Ahmaud Arbery last May. He was the young man who was jogging and killed by white men in Georgia. And the response from my ostensibly progressive white church, some was just like, oh, okay. But there was language of Black Lives Matter and so on in the confession for the liturgy that week. I received a lot of all lives matter. It was almost like a tick. And I also received horrifically prejudiced email directed at my daughter from a member. I won't go into specifics, but I just use it as an example to say that that's been the pushback. A lot of white liberal Christians want to focus on how can we understand or transform supporters and voters for Donald Trump. We need to look inward. I've messed up plenty and I've been called in, but we need to build muscles to know that when we're asked to jump for liberation, our first response is, how high?
Thank you, Seth, for those responses and insights. Marjorie, can we hear from you? Where have you experienced resistance and pushback? I think, Marjorie, you're muted. If you can unmute yourself,
sorry.
Please. Thank you.
I was trying to get my power cord in. I think I'll probably speak more generally, because in some ways I'm also in a privileged position in that I have a job, I have support, and I'm in a context where the leadership of the institution is committed to moving this agenda. None of those things can be taken for granted, and it makes it harder when people don't have, when there is political will in the institution and support from your line managers to pursue this. So that's the first thing I'd like to start off with. I think one of the things perhaps I have not done so well, and maybe others too, is to plan for the inevitable backlash. We're seeing it, and it's not new. And we have intersectional backlash going on too, because there are those who seem to be pushing back at women in leadership, as well as Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. So I think that it's not new, it's inevitable, and we have to look at that. Another area has to deal with legal and procedural provisions. So in the context of Canada, for example, we have one province that has legislation in place that people employed by civil servants cannot wear religious symbols, which disproportionately affects Muslim women. I mean, let's just cut to the chase. So that is a whole level of what you have to do to get that dealt with when it's legislation. And Chevon spoke of what's happening in the United States and the work of Stacey Abrams, although he didn't say specifically, but what do you do, the kind of work of Stacey Abrams and so on, how do we deal with legal pushback? But I think also for institutions like church, like the universities, the other thing I'm seeing is that sometimes you have procedures and systems that have built-in barriers that are not easily identifiable. Okay, So you may have provisions for scholarships or for hiring that seem to be okay, but if the provisions were set up only by white people, they might not understand some of the barriers. So certainly part of our work is to begin to say specifically, where are the barriers that might not have been intended, but because they did not have in the original construction, a diversity lens may have built-in barriers for Black people, LGBTQ people, for poor people. Because don't forget, we have working class, that they may not be able to access these things for certain reasons that might not have been thought of. I think also another question is white fragility. You know, so we have had a lot of conversation about how do we create safe spaces for Black people and white people to talk, that if Black people get upset, if they express anger, if they express sadness, if they express their frustration at trying to get this to change for how many centuries and it doesn't seem to be moving, racism just seems to be persisting and mutating, as one European report said. Can we all stay in the conversation? And can we create spaces where we can express our emotions and we can find a way through this to the kind of solidarity that we want to make sure nobody is left behind because they're poor, because they're somebody of color, because they're a woman, because they're two-spirit LGBTQ, and so on. And finally, I would say the divide and rule systems within and among Black communities. So we don't want to see Indigenous rights pitted against Black lives, pitted against Asian rights, and the divisions within the respective communities, depending on which Indigenous community you're from, or whether you're Black from the continent, Canada, or the Caribbean. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of these things are there and require the naming that was mentioned, intentionality. Maybe the last thing I say is just exhaustion and burnout. We need to understand that COVID-19, the psychologists have all kinds of ways of saying what COVID-19 represents. This is a complex of grief and trauma that the whole world has been experiencing. Drip, 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 drip for over a year. So I just want to encourage everybody, this is my preaching moment now, to take some Elijah moments and hear the angels saying, look, this struggle is very important. You're fighting the prophets of Baal and whatnot, but bro, you need to just eat some food, sleep, and then afterwards you're on God. You can hear the still small voice and discern and get a perspective. You're not the only one. You know, other people haven't bent a knee to Baal. So just take hold of the burnout, do some self-care. As I said, this is my sermon, but COVID-19 has put extra stress on all activists and most people in the world. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And thank you for the mini sermon. Siobhan, do you have any brief reflections in response to this question about resistance, pushback?
No, just in brief, I think one of the things that I've witnessed over the years when we articulate what structures can do, what racism has done, I think the damage that I've seen is after those articulations, after we've shared our experiences, is that in many ways it's reinterpreted. And in the US, we have a term that we call that. We call it white-splaining, or we call it, even for males, we call it mansplaining, that we kind of reinterpret what we're hearing. And I've seen that happen time and time again, especially even in negotiations with some of our protest movements, when we get into actual conversations with public officials, and then it changes the end result to fit those persons or communities that are in positions of privilege. And so I think that's really a lot of the resistance that I've seen. Okay, and they'll check off on their list. I've met with the indigenous communities. I've met with African-American communities, and see, we're an inclusive government, but it hasn't created that change. And I've seen that in our denomination, in churches, and even I think just one of the questions that, are we talking about the institutions? Are we talking about local churches? And I would say we're talking about all levels of society, whether it's the churches, whether it's civic governments, that you see that taking place. So I think that's the biggest thing. The other thing is that I'm probably on the wrong day to be a panelist, because I'm really attracted to the historical Jesus movement, the historical person of Jesus. Even when Seth was describing what the historical Jesus looked like, I really think that's what we're trying to get the truth to the people who possess an understanding of a colonized version of Christianity that leads into some of these racist undertones of white privilege, of all of these things. And so that's where I've seen a lot of resistance in sermons, in affirming our interfaith dialogue, interfaith communities, understandings of the voice of God, theology, that people will shake their heads, but then they'll go about doing the same thing. And as one who engages in teaching seminary courses, graduate level courses from time to time, I see that embedded in the papers that I have to grade, in some of the sermons I have to hear, these kind of things. So that's where I see a lot of the resistance of even understanding the true diversity in theological expression. So just in short, I share that.
Great, thank you so much for those reflections. And thank you to all of you for sharing. And noting that the question of resistance and pushback in anti-racism work is not a question of if, is a question of when. And noting that in some cases, in many cases, that pushback comes from people in churches who are white, liberal, progressive peoples who may be justice seeking in other areas and yet are resistant in engaging in questions of racial justice. And noting too that some of this is rooted in legacies of colonialism, as we talked about in other days. And thank you all for noting that some of this backlash is both, it's not only inevitable, it's intersectional. The challenge of structures, resisting structures, and this note around reminding about white-splaining and mansplaining. So thank you all for this response. We'll explore one last question. I'll invite Siobhan to be the respondent for this question, the first respondent for this question. And this is just noting that very often minority and oppressed communities are sometimes pitted against each other. So in what ways do you think that the church can work to bring about active solidarities among people who are oppressed? So I'd invite your responses to that question, please.
Just off my first response to what can churches as institutions do, and I really think there's some truth to this, is putting those persons from respective communities in positions of equality, positions of, I don't want to say power, because we look at that in the wrong way as Western society, as the church, as government, but in positions of equality. Oftentimes we have a token minority, a token person, and we put them on our councils, we put them in, on our committees, and we expect that person to achieve racial harmony. And that's not ever going to occur. Because the question is, like, while you may do that, how many, let's just speak bluntly, how many white voices are on that same committee? That if you're looking for equality, the same number of voices representing other communities has to be equal. And in my opinion, that's kind of where we have that starting point. Because out of those conversations, we will begin to eliminate some of the harms that have occurred when we see communities that are pitted against each other. I have a colleague of mine here in the central United States who talks about when we're thrown into a room, we're trying to advocate for our communities, it's oftentimes we start engaging in who's the most oppressed in the room. And we start listing these stories. So it has to be almost a spiritual endeavor of us respecting And that first photo that we started out our conversation today with really embodies that, because we have to recognize the level of violence that has occurred in so many different communities reverently. And when we join, let's say, a Black Lives Matter protest, and myself, my daughters, my family were a part of those here in the central part of the US, is that we come with contrition, not to interpret what we're hearing or what we're seeing, but how do we affirm and walk in solidarity? How do we even acknowledge the privilege that we possess? And I think that's some of the work that we're still beginning to figure out. But I'm thankful that we're now in that process. When we see Black Lives Matter persons, we see Indigenous peoples, we see those members of our Asian communities who have suffered violence walking together and saying, no, we're not going to do this. This is not the world that we want to live in and we want our children to live in. So in my opinion, that's kind of the work that we have to do, recognizing that. And part of that is, even we've so nonchalantly, so freely have talked about the term decolonizing, we have to realize that the majority of peoples in colonized communities do not even realize they are a part of a colonized community. They do not even realize that there's a different way of existing. There's a different way of understanding God. There's a different way of understanding the Gospels. There's a different way of understanding our existence. And I'm thankful that, we as Indigenous peoples, we still possess some of that cosmology of how do we live in harmony with each other? How do we live in our understanding of balance? And so I'm thankful that those traditions can still provide us that wisdom when we see what is going on. And it's my hope that structures like the church can listen, can remove that assumption of power and authority by understanding how we live. Even as I sit here and I talk about Indigenous peoples who I represent in different capacities, we can't even look at, think concepts such as the color of one's skin. For Indigenous peoples can be the fairest of skin to the darkest of skin. They can have all hair color, they can have all eye colors. It's understanding that, we have a way of existence that has preserved a way of life for thousands of years. And it can give us wisdom today as we try to speak to churches about what does it mean to be in balance. And so that's what my hope is that somehow, we don't fall into that same cycle. We see it happen in church structures when it's time to discuss a budget that, they say, well, here's your amount, y'all figure it out over there. My hope is that we can truly understand what harmony and what equality means. So I'll stop at that point and sharing.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I will just give 1 minute each to Seth and Marjorie if you have any last reflections, very brief reflections to wrap us up, please.
Okay, thanks. I want to respond to the same thing in closing, that we need to look at theological education. One of the suggestions here is that we should have an Indigenous elder in residence. And I've seen models like that at San DeSoto. So how do we broaden the curriculum and the book list so that Black scholars, Indigenous scholars are mainstreamed on the agenda? There needs to be funds allocated for self-advocacy, capacity building, and so on, beyond just welfare things for people of color. And I would like to challenge every pastor, every leader to look at the model of pastoral caregiving. So you have the traditional model of healing, guiding, sustaining, and reconciling. But people like Emmanuel Lartey are saying that pastoral care includes liberating, includes empowering, and there is material, for example, in nurturing identity, so nurturing LGBTQ identity, nurturing Black identity. Those things need to be in the curriculum, and those things need to be part of the ongoing the ongoing formation of clergy and other leaders. So I'm into the practical stuff as to how we break this. And an important part is in the formation and in the provision of support for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to be self-advocates and to be liberated.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marjorie. Seth, brief comments from you.
I'll try to keep it brief. One of the things I also hear a lot from fellow white Christians when confronted with the calls to action, the calls to solidarity, the calls for liberation, the news is, well, I just don't know what to do. What am I going to do? And it's one of the great victories of white supremacy, as well as what I said earlier, is in convincing us who have conferred ourselves all the power, wealth, might, and influence that we don't know what to do or don't have those things. And this is an insidious lie. And so while I've had some damning and challenging things to say about the white church in the United States, as Marjorie and Javon just said as well, I think there's also hope, because when we're talking about locating ourselves as followers of a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who was born to an unwed teenage mother in an unimportant part of the world, living under occupation and empirical oppression. This is me borrowing the words from my dear friend, Reverend Asajifu Sekou. We say this person and the way he modeled relationships and moved in the world and died and lived again, conquered empire. And we call that Easter. This person who says, I've come that they may all have life and have it abundantly. So yes, this theological education and hope, this discipleship that must happen, yeah, I'll speak from my own context, and white churches needs to start with moving beyond, it's a scarcity mindset that says justice issues or different people groups have to be in competition with each other. There is abundance to go around. White churches are sitting on a lot of it. White supremacy wants us to think there's scarcity. Jesus wants us to think abundantly. And if we can get out of our own ways and kind of stop sitting on the vault, incredible transformations are going to happen. And it's just believing that that's true and doing it. We only pass this way once, as John Lewis said. Let's do it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seth. And thank you to all of our panelists for this engaged conversation today. Thank you, Javon and Marjorie and Seth and Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos unfortunately continued to have technical difficulties, so he was not able to rejoin us, but we are thankful for the time that he was with us and for the contributions that he offered at that time. So thank you all once again. I would just note, as we're coming to an end, that there have been a few additional questions that were posed in the chat. Unfortunately, we will not have enough time to explore those today, but we will carry them forward to tomorrow's session, and aim to explore those at that time. So thank you for those questions. They have not been lost, but they will carry forward. As we move to wrap up today's session, I'll just note that there has been a lot of words so far. And so for those who are able, if we'll just have a moment of silent reflection, just to process much of what we've heard. It can be a time of prayer, it can be a time of processing. If you would like to write some notes down, you're welcome to do that. And as we take this moment of silence, maybe an invitation was a question that was emerged earlier in the conversation, the question of how far are we willing to go to dismantle racial injustice in church and society? So a suggestion for a question for reflection. Thank you all for taking this brief pause for reflection, and We're welcome to, of course, continue to reflect as we bring this session to an end. We would invite you to join us once again tomorrow, where we will be exploring the theme anti-racist markers for churches. This will be a very practical, action-oriented session where we're looking at what would an ideal anti-racist and anti-discriminatory church look like. So we'll be exploring ways of reimagining, dreaming, and envisioning what a church could look like, be like, feel like. We'll explore examples of anti-racist and anti-discriminatory behavior, hear from people who are actively engaged in the work to share principles and markers of good practice. So we'll continue this conversation today in a very practical way. This will be an action-oriented session that you will not want to miss. So we hope you will join us tomorrow. Thank you once again for your time and attention today, and we hope that you have a good day. Blessings to you.